The Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. President Donald Trump announced yet another attempt to reverse President Obama's signature policies on Friday, this time the opening towards Cuba. Trump's new Cuba policy, however, does not totally erode the Obama policy, simply tweaks it to appear as if it's being eroded by adding restrictions on tourism and trade with Cuba. It does, however, restrict U.S. business transactions with Cuba's military business conglomerates. Miami Cuban-American politicians such as Senator Marco Rubio and Mario Diaz-Balart were primarily responsible for drafting of the new policy. Here's an excerpt from Trump's announcement on Friday.
The outcome of last administration's executive action has been only more repression and a move to crush the peaceful democratic movement. Therefore, effective immediately, I am canceling the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba. Our new policy begins with strictly enforcing U.S. law. We will not lift sanctions on the Cuban regime until all political prisoners are freed, freedoms of assembly and expression are respected, all political parties are legalized, and free and internationally supervised elections are scheduled.
Joining us now to analyze this new Cuba policy is James Early. James is former Director of Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Institution and a member of the Real News Board. Thanks for joining us today, James.
Thank you.
So, James, what impact will this policy do in terms of reversing the opening to Cuba?
Well, there is really no reversal. There is a lot of bombast and throwing particular bones to particular right-wing politicians, whom I will not refer to as dogs here. It will condition the tone and tenor of what will be a continuing bilateral relationship, as Trump pointed out. It was a mixed, convoluted message, as is characteristic of Trump, who on the one hand says he respects Cuban sovereignty, on the other hand he wants to help the Cuban people. It really simply conditions two specific arenas. One of the 12 categories of travel for U.S. citizens, it incurs against the human rights of U.S. citizens, that is our right to freedom of travel, and really puts an audit on all citizens who are going on self-proclaimed travel. They must have documentation that lasts up to 5 years that will verify that they have done exactly what that people-to-people category has done. So it will dampen that, and it will cut down on the number of people that do go to Cuba. It will condition economic relations with the economic dimension of the Cuban military, which it is said has influence of up to 60% of the economy of Cuba. However, it throws another real relief to the travel business and to the people who are involved in businesses related to travel, in that the Cuban military certainly will protect them against any ills, and the U.S. will not invade upon that. So there have been some small tactical changes. The real question is what will come from the other side with the Cubans. The Cubans hold as high priority, you must deal with them with respect. You can disagree with them fundamentally, but they demand to be respected. So I think the bombastic tone against the Cuban government will have some chilling effect, but it will not alter the advance. It will slow down the advance, but not alter the advance on the 21 plus agreements that are already underway with the Cuban government, and the $6 billion or so that's already in play economically.
to me makes no sense. A poll conducted last December indicates that 60% of all Republicans, I must say again, Republicans actually supported Obama's opening towards Cuba. A recent Pew poll done just this week finds that 75% of Americans supported the opening towards Cuba, and 73% of Americans supports lifting of the sanctions altogether. Where is Trump going with this policy?
Well, this is clearly a political stand playing to his right-wing and conservative base, and to that very, very small group of right-wing Cuban Americans with Diaz-Balart and with Marco Rubio, who really do not represent the social base of Cuban citizens, even on the conservative side of the aisle, as your statistics have pointed out, that 84% of young Cubans want open travel, 69% or so of Cubans want to maintain bilateral relations, and 75% of U.S. citizens, and all which encompasses Cubans Americans, want to maintain bilateral relations with Cuba and advance towards normalization of relations. So in this instance, Trump, as usual, defies any of the standard political protocols that pundits tend to look at. But it is really a lot of bombast, and he is so ensconced in, so mired in scandal and leaks around his presidency. One cannot think that he's going to be able to give a lot of attention to this. And the final details won't come out for 30 to 90 days when the Treasury Department really puts down what the protocols will be.
James, Trump harps a lot about him being a businessman and a negotiator, and he's the best negotiator that there is. And in his speech he just gave in announcing these restrictions, he welcomes the Cuban government back to the negotiating table to make a new deal with the U.S. And you are one who is rather friendly with the Cuban government. You go back and forth, you travel a lot, you know the climate there. Is there any chance of that happening?
Well, first and foremost, I think we must recognize that negotiations are already in play, and they are the negotiations, the frameworks, and the policies that President Raul Castro of Cuba and President Barack Obama, then President of the United States, set forth, and that there is a bilateral team of very well-honed Cuban government representatives, as well as U.S. representatives, are working on such things as postal service, drug interdiction, setting up relationships of patents with Cuban vaccines against cancer, migration policies, the rescission of the dry foot policy that allowed any Cuban who touched ground in the United States to be fully incorporated. None of that is being rolled back. So Trump can talk about the Cubans coming back to the negotiation table, but the fact of the matter is that the negotiation table is already in play. I think it will be slowed down in some ways and more protracted than what it was already going to be. But this really, in my view, plays right into the strategic orientations that the Cubans have set forth. President Raul Castro has been very consistent and emphatic about his policies, both his government policies and citizens' engagement of those policies within Cuba and within the international arena. And it's summed up in the phrase, without haste, without pause. So there will be no haste, and certainly Donald Trump has added fuel to make sure that that haste does not move very fastly. And there will be no pause. As Donald Trump has said, he respects the sovereignty of Cuba, and that they will be at the negotiating table. So there's a lot of bombast here, a lot of puffery, but the substance is really, again, around those two areas of people-to-people travel and certain conditionalities on economic exchanges that involve the Cuban military, which is a major player in the internal Cuban economy.
And finally, James, when we see the media coverage of this particular issue and the eroding of the opening and the Cuba policy, we often see people going to Cuba. It's a popular place to go to, and then covering it from that angle of the impact it will have on Cubans, but very little coverage in terms of how this new policy is going to impact on Americans doing business in Cuba as a result of that opening. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, two key things. One, the symbolism of where this event was held in Miami at the Manuel Amirti Hall, who was one of the soldiers who went with the Bay of Pigs to try to overthrow the Cuban Revolution, an agent of the CIA, involved with groups who put bombs in Cuban hotels, tried to assassinate Fidel Castro many, many times, who tried to spoil Cuban crops and poison livestock in Cuba. This is who Trump continues to associate himself is with these right-wing terrorists here in the United States of America. And on the other hand, he speaks very loudly, but he shows no substance. There is a debate within his own cabinet members, and his cabinet members, I would venture to say, empirically have won out by saying, maintain the pragmatic advances put forth by Raul Castro and Barack Obama. Do not touch the heart of those things. And again, tactically, they have conditioned people-to-people travel, but not the other 11 categories. And finally, what the American public needs to realize and become more proactive about and make sure that we don't align ourselves with the imperial policies of the United States government is that the United States citizens are not the only people traveling to Cuba. The Cubans are not building hotels just for people from the United States of America. They have a large tourist trade within Latin America, from Brazil and Colombia and Venezuela and other areas. Large European travelers, including Russian and increased Chinese travelers. So there will be some statistical drop in the amount of visitors that come, but it will not alter the upward trajectory of the advance of Cuban development and hotels and the jobs that come with that and the exercise of small entrepreneurship among Cubans, all of which the Cuban government embraces.
Let me add to that, 1 million Canadians go south to Cuba during the winter months on holidays. So you can see that not only Americans go to Cuba, and if they do, it's a recent phenomena anyway. Thanks so much for joining me.
If I might add one other thing I hope that will be considered is the calling of the name of Cheshire Sata Shakur, who is in exile in Cuba for allegedly being involved in the killing of a New Jersey policeman, was another bone thrown to New Jersey politicians. But we should pay close attention. The Cubans have observed international protocols about exiles, and I expect that they will maintain that posture around Assata Shakur. I know that many progressives, particularly within the African-American communities, both liberal and radical, will be concerned about the mention of Cheshmire's name, who is Assata Shakur.
Thanks for adding that, James.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.